Hello, everyone, and welcome to Heritage University Presents Reserve Study Trends and Impacts as presented by Henry McKenna of Reserve Advisors. My name is Melissa Rogers, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Heritage Property Management, and I am so glad that you are joining us tonight. We are going to have a jam-packed session of information. Not only is Henry going to cover the basics of what a reserve study is, why it might be necessary for your association, but he's also going to delve in a little bit deeper to kind of tell you a little bit about what's happening in some surrounding states to the state of Georgia and some potential impacts that we may see here as time goes on with legislation. So, as always, for those of you joining us for the first time, thank you so much. We appreciate your attendance. And if you are returning, welcome back. We're happy to have you as well. All questions are going to be answered tonight at the end of our session. So this is going to be about a 45-50-minute class where we'll leave some time at the very end for Q&A with Henry and myself. So don't worry, as Henry goes through the presentation, feel free to drop your questions in the upper right-hand corner where it says the Q&A box. You're more than welcome to communicate those as we go throughout the presentation. Also, as far as questions are concerned, we do want to keep this high level and not necessarily property specific if possible, because we are going to be talking about a lot of content and a lot of information. So if you have any specific questions for your particular association or for your management company by chance, if you are professionally managed, we certainly encourage that you either reach out to your community manager or your association's attorney for specific and particular guidance. So just keep that in mind. Kind of try and keep those questions as general as possible. And I promise you, Henry will have plenty of time to answer any of the more detailed ones that you may have, so long as they are not super property specific. In any case, we are going to go ahead and get tonight's class started. Henry, we are so thrilled that you are joining us. This is, I think, the second or third time that we've had Reserve Advisors join us, but this is the first time we've had the privilege of having you as our host. So welcome.
Thank you so much, and I'm very excited to be here, and I just want to echo some of your comments and really just thank you guys for taking the time out of your evenings to join me on, reserve studies are not the most exciting topics out there, but they are becoming exceptionally more prevalent out in the community association landscape out there. So I really did want to focus in on some of these big changes that we're seeing, not only in Georgia, but throughout the whole country, and how reserve studies are really being impacted throughout the Community Association Institute. And I'm sure a lot of you who are joining this call are starting to see this now and starting to get more and more questions throughout your community about the use of reserve studies. Why are they needed? Do we need one right now? And what are these things? What do they actually accomplish, and how are they being used out there? So to start things off, like Melissa said, I got a lot of content to review. I'm going to try flying through a lot of this, but would love to answer each and every one of your questions. If we don't get them tonight, more than happy to take these questions offline and touch base with you guys individually too, and hopefully help you out with all your questions. So with that being said, we're going to kick off things. So once again, this whole topic of reserve studies has been super, super popular in the past few years. And the true catalyst behind this, unfortunately, came with a tragedy. As a lot of you may know, there was that unfortunate accident that happened in Surfside, Florida, where the Champlain Tower did collapse. And this was back in 2021. Nearly 100 people lost their lives in this condominium building. And since that tragedy happened, there has been a significant spotlight on reserve studies and just capital planning in general too. So with that tragedy, a lot of state and federal started stepping in, because there's the number one issue out there of how do we avoid this? We never want to see an issue like this happen anywhere again throughout the whole country. And what can we do to help ensure that our boards and our communities are in a good spot and they do have proper structural integrity in place, And so ultimately just to make sure our communities, are they making the right decisions? Are we taking care of these very serious projects? Are we planning ahead? And are we taking these funds that we need to collect today to take care of future problems? So this really, once again, has been a huge catalyst to the reserve study industry, because we need to start focusing on how do we take care of these very serious structural integrity issues, and how do we make sure that us as communities, we are taking proactive approach on this so that we can avoid any kind of serious issues in the future. So once again, this is a very big catalyst to the industry, and this is where we started seeing a lot of states starting to step in and say, hey, maybe we need to take measures a little bit further, and maybe we do need to look into some mandates behind reserve study and behind capital planning in general. So since Surfside, there's been a lot of states that have implemented different legislations out there. And I do want to be transparent. Every state is very unique of what they're requesting and what they're requiring through communities when it comes to reserve studies out there. So not every state's exactly the same. Everybody's going to have a little differences out there of what they're asking for communities. But there is one common theme out there. And I can tell you that states are becoming more and more popular with passing some sort of legislation that does look into having communities have reserve studies done and enact on those reserve studies as well. So of course, Florida, right after Surfside, they did enact laws very quickly there to mandate reserve studies. And I am going to go into some more specifics about Florida because they are the most aggressive state. But beyond that, Maryland, Virginia, Minnesota, Tennessee, New Jersey, and majority of the West Coast, who already had some laws in place, but they did some tweaking on those. Beyond just that, too, we're seeing more and more states pop up. So within the past 2 years, we've seen Illinois, Michigan, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Colorado all start looking into legislations to mandate reserve studies throughout community associations, because once again, we're trying to look into the best interest for community associations, making sure that we do have plans in place and we do have right information for boards to make these really tough and hard decisions of keeping up our properties and protecting our assets at the end of the day. So I do want to dive in a little bit on Florida itself. After Surfside, there was very aggressive plans in place to prevent these kind of tragedies, and reserve studies was very top of mind of where do we start before these things really do pop up. So they did implement in 2022 some reserve study laws out there, and they actually took a step up. Beyond just requiring reserve studies throughout community associations, they implemented something called a SIR study as well. And so I want to highlight that because it is a little unique. When we consider a reserve study, we're looking at all the common elements throughout our association, and we're putting together a budget plan of how do we protect these assets and what are the plans in place that we should do to make sure that we are reserving the correct amount of funds to take on these major repairs and replacements. Well, Florida did it a little bit unique. They broke it out into two different buckets. There's a reserve study, and then there's a structural integrity reserve study, which basically took out all the structural parts, structural frames, roofing, piping, life safety systems, electrical systems, and essentially within that reserve study, whatever was being recommended by the reserve study provider, boards were enforced to fund those. So typically when you get a reserve study done, it's typically just used as a budgeting tool. It's a guideline. You're getting information to make these decisions, but at the end of the day, it's up to the board on how they want to go about their budget and how they want to pass it. But it's really just giving you the ammunition to know, hey, what is going to be the right way? Florida changed that a little bit and said, there's no more pushing things off. And we can't, just because there's tough numbers coming out there and tough numbers in the future, we can no longer push these off. We need to implement these projects. We have to make sure that our boards are saving up and are reserving for these critical projects within these structural integrities. So those rules were enforced in 2022. But as you guys may have seen in Florida, there's been a pretty rough housing crisis down there. So unfortunately, due to the reserve studies and due to insurance and a lot of other factors out there, it's been really difficult for community association members to afford their dues each and every month. And once again, a lot of factors went into that. So they had to look into some of those laws and they had to provide a little bit of relief out there. One common thing was they're not taking away that reserve study mandate. They see the positive impact that has happened over the past 3 years of just communities now getting this information and understanding, hey, these are our responsibilities. And now we can start having these very productive conversations of how we should budget. Unfortunately, what we see very often in our line of business, not even in Florida, but all throughout the country, is when we worked with communities for the very first time, we get into a community and we see a lot of underfunded reserves, and we see a lot of projects that should have been taken up many years ago, But what essentially happens a lot of times is just boards didn't have the funds available, and they didn't want to be the bad person telling their neighbors that, hey, we do need to have a pretty serious hike up in our funds. And it's hard to pass that information, and we understand that. And we dub that term board paralysis, where we know there's issues out there. We know we have a lot of things to take up, but we don't want to be the bad guy. And we don't want to tell our neighbors that, hey, we really do need to make some tough decisions, whether that be increase our dues highly or look into loans of credit or even pass special assessments out there. But unfortunately, these are the conversations we do need to have and we do need to enact now to make sure that we don't run into issues in the future. But focusing back on Florida, they did realize that some of those guidelines were a little too strict, and it did put a lot of handcuffs on community association members and boards out there. So they eased off a little bit. The SERS is still in place. What they did say is that anything over $25,000 now or above cost, that's still going to be mandated for the funding. But anything below that $25,000, there is flexibility. If you don't need to fund that, there's alternative routes in the future that you can make some alternative plans to collect those funds. Along those lines, too, it doesn't have to come straight from reserves. Now, associations may use loans or line of credit or special assessments and get creative with those funding plans, because as we've seen, when we're just asking our homeowners to triple, quadruple those reserve funds needs, it was very burdensome on a lot of people. So now Florida said, let's pump our brakes a little bit and let's make sure that there is other options out there. The reserve funding as well. Associations can pause that SERS contribution for up to 2 years to address some milestone inspection repairs first, but then they must resume with that SERS after that 2-year period. And then last two, compliance reporting. Boards must sign an affidavit confirming receipt of the completed SERS out there, and a standardized reporting form will soon be required to be reported to Florida. Essentially what that means is they want to make sure that boards are actually taking up on this, and they want to make sure that boards are being compliant. Most states out in the nation right now, there isn't a whole lot of compliance out there. Yes, there are mandates, but no one's really policing it besides real estate agents and besides lending associations out there, which we will get into a little bit. And the only reason I bring this up, I understand that we're not in Florida right now, but I like to bring this up because this is very prevalent, because I do feel that we are going to see a lot of states in the very near future enact a lot of similar laws out there. They may not be as aggressive as Florida, and I think Florida is a very good case study right now because we're learning. This is all very new to all of us in the community association, and so it's very new to all of us in the reserve study world too when there is these specific mandates out there. But I do feel that this is going to be a positive progression, and pretty soon throughout the country, we are going to see some very similar things to this where we can avoid that board paralysis and make sure that our communities are having plans in place and that there is actionable plans that we can follow just to make sure that we're all in a safe spot and we are taking up these very important projects. With that being said, I want to get back to locally here in Georgia. So currently in Georgia, there is no requirement to conduct a reserve study. There's no requirement to fund your reserves out there. There's a lot of states right now that don't have reserve study requirements, but they do say, hey, you gotta at least put maybe 10% of your annual assessments into that reserve account and you could be good. A lot of those rules are changing. And once again, Georgia does not have any specific bills in place right now, and there's nothing that I can tell you that's going to get passed in the very near future. I would say, though, that if I was going to bet on this, I would say within the next 5 years or so, I would not be surprised if Georgia does come out with some sort of mandate out there, and all the neighboring states as well. I'm very confident that there's going to be more evolution to this, and we will start seeing a lot more state mandates and federal mandates as well. With that being said, too, the reason why I'm very confident in that, financial institutions have really stepped in. And so what I mean by financial institutions is when you're trying to buy or sell your condo, lenders now, they want to make sure if they're giving out a loan to someone to go into a condo association, they want to make sure that that's going to be a very safe loan. If you're going to lend out someone $500,000, you want to make sure that you're going to be able to get that money back and that your lender is not going to get hit with a very huge special assessment that they weren't aware of. They want to make sure that this association does have some sort of funds built up. So this is very new. Once again, the past 2 years, we've seen very increased spotlights on financial institutions now asking to see, hey, we have a potential buyer, but we need to see a reserve study for this association in order to confirm this loan and actually give this out. On top of that, too, beyond just the mortgage approval, too, and when you're trying to attain a loan for a capital project now. So if you as an association wants to go out, maybe you don't have enough reserves set up right now and you do need to take care of your roofs and you want to go out to a banker, they want to see what else is going on in the association. They want to see how financially healthy you guys are and ultimately make sure that if they're going to give out that loan, that there is some sort of plan in place that this association can pay that back and does have a capital plan in place for the future as well. Refinancing with mortgages, same exact thing too. If you're in a condo right now and you do want to look into a refinance, they do want to consider what is the current state of your association. Are you financially healthy? Is there any kind of concerns out there? And reserve studies are now a big consideration of all these topics. Now, one very, very hot topic out there when we think about lending is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac back up, I believe, I don't have the exact percentage, but I believe it's about 70% of all the loans throughout America goes through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And they have really stepped up their spotlight when it comes to condo association loans. And so they put in some very aggressive asks now when they are giving out these loans. And reserve studies is a very, very important topic to them. Why are they asking for the reserve studies? Much like the other bankers out there, they want to ensure that this association does have some sort of financial health available. More importantly, they want to see, is there any kind of significant deferred maintenance out there? So a reserve study report is going to document all those shared assets out there, and they're looking to see, is there any kind of major concerns? If a new buyer goes into this, is there going to be a major balcony repair? Is there major structural concerns? They want to know what that buyer is getting into, and they want to make sure that these associations are in a good spot out there. There's plenty of other things that they're looking for beyond the reserve study. They're also looking at insurance risk too. They're looking to see, is there any kind of legal or financial troubles that the association is currently undergoing. And what we've actually seen, and this isn't the proper name for it, but this is what we've dubbed it in the industry, there's now a condo blacklist out there. So if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac does see an association that has these issues, they are getting put on this blacklist where they are not giving out these loans. So potential buyers will not be able to get backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac to move into that. And certainly, once again, that reserve study out there is being used as a very common ask for them to get this information. So on this slide, you're going to see a picture here, and this picture was actually taken from one of our reserve study reports. This was last year at a parking garage in downtown Chicago. And just a very quick example here, we did a report for this association. We notated some water infiltration beneath the garage floor for this association. Now, I can tell you folks, every single parking garage in Chicago and most parking garages in Atlanta and all throughout the country, they all have this exact same problem of water infiltration. When we did the report, this is not a big issue. In our reserve study analysis, we did notate this and we put into the report, hey, these are some potential issues that you want to take care of today before these become bigger issues in the future. But what had happened was this particular association did end up on the blacklist. And the manager of this association gave us a call in a frantic frenzy earlier this year and said, hey, we just got blacklisted by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac because of your reserve study report. And we were troubled by it. We were wondering, like, how did that happen? You know, your building was in really good health. I can't understand why Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would put you on the blacklist. So we actually contacted them ourselves to figure out why. You know, what did they interpret from this report that made them get on the blacklist? So we had a conversation with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and no joke, within 5 minutes, they brought up this exact picture, and we let them know, hey, this is actually not that serious of a problem. Our reserve study analysis is simply just trying to let people know, let the board know what are some remedies to make sure this doesn't become a bigger problem. And within that 5-minute conversation, that blacklist was actually reversed out there. And so the reason I bring up this example, this is all very new and very organic. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they're still trying to learn a lot of things and they're still trying to interpret reports correctly. So if you are in that particular situation right now and you do end up on that blacklist, please dive a little bit further into that. There are certainly circumstances out there where things are very severe and you do need to take action on them. But the only reason I bring this up because once again, everything is so new and everybody's trying to learn and we're all trying to get caught up to speed here. Another example, this actually happened to us. I don't have a photo of this. We did a reserve study in New York City. We labeled our roofs in fair condition. Most of the reserve studies we do, roofs are typically in fair condition if they're 5 to 10 years old. Not a big problem out there. The same exact thing happened. This association landed on this blacklist. Manager called us in a frenzy, and we had to go through the same process. Call Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and just say, hey, guys, can you just explain to us a little bit more of why this is getting blacklisted? And within not even 3 minutes, they said, hey, that's actually our fault. We misread that report. We'll get this reversed. We'll work with the association and their management team to make sure that they are covered for the future. So we're seeing a lot of mistakes out there. And once again, I just want to reassure everybody that this is very new and very organic out there, but it's going to evolve. And this team is going to get better. And one thing I would like to stress is that this isn't going away. Yes, once again, we are seeing a lot of kind of mistakes and a lot of things out there, but their team is only getting better, and it's only going to get broader and broader. And we are going to see a lot of cases where there's going to be associations where they do need to take some actions out there. And that reserve study is serving as kind of that first point of where to go and how do we resolve some of these issues. So I do want to dive into the why. Why are reserve studies being the big focus here? And, why are lending institutions thinking about this? And truly, it's because all of us as associations, we all have the very same common challenge. Whether you're in an HOA and you may maintain just a clubhouse, maybe some walking paths or a pond, or you're in a high-rise building downtown Atlanta and you have tons of mechanicals out there, elevators, facade, lots of components to maintain. At the end of the day, associations are always going to have some sort of asset that they got to look after and they have to maintain. If you're on the board, you have a fiduciary responsibility. You need to protect and increase the asset of the association. And as we all know, things are not going to last forever. And we do need to have some sort of plan in place to take up on these actions. So we need to understand, when are our roofs going to be at the end of their lives, and when do we need to take action to get these replaced? So when we think about that and we think about our capital planning, there's three main mechanisms of funding out there. First and foremost is our reserve account. It's what we're budgeting for every year. We're sitting down, we're doing our budget meetings, and we're dedicating a certain amount that's going to go straight into this reserve account. Now, it's not an operational account. It's not to be used for operating budget, which of course is going to be your yearly expenses for your management team, landscaping, water bills, and all that. This reserve account is strictly dedicated for capital projects that is going to be focused on the reserve study. If we don't have enough money in our reserve account, and if we're not planning ahead, we could also look into bank loans. Now, bank loans are a very nice mechanism because we can get cash in very quick. But as we all know, if we take a bank loan, we're going to be spending some more money on top of that. So it's not very favorable for the associations in every case. But once again, sometimes we do need that money quick, and a loan is going to be a very good option for us. We're just going to be paying some more money back on that. The last mechanism, not everybody's favorite term out there, special assessments, obviously can be very burdensome. No one wants to get hit by a surprise and learn that they have to spend money out of their pocket to take on a project out there. But sometimes, once again, it's a mechanism that we have to use when we do need to get those funds immediately and we do need to take care of projects right away. But if we think about those three mechanisms, obviously that reserve account makes a whole lot of sense. If we can plan ahead and understand what those future expenditures are going to be, and if we can go into every single budget meeting knowing what's going to be that proper number, we can avoid those bank loans and we can avoid those special assessments because we're planning for the future and we're taking those funds and setting them aside. And one theory out there that we're trying to do better at explaining too is we often see a lot of times when we work with associations, it's always that last minute. When we go on site and we see a lot of projects that are coming up next year, there was no funds ever budgeted for those, and now it's top of mind. Our roofs are falling apart, and guess what? The past 15 years, we didn't think about those roofs, but now that ticking time clock is coming down to the wire, and we do need to start thinking about them, but we just don't have the money for it. And truly, the way we should think about this is when we think about budgeting and we think about doing these reserve studies, we need to start thinking about the use we're using today. If we're in a brand new association, let's assume that you moved into a brand new townhome just built this year. Everything's brand spanking new. It feels good. Your roof's brand new, your siding's brand new, you got brand new sidewalks, driveways, everything's all good. The last thing people are thinking about is, oh man, I got to put money aside for that roof. And we understand that. Obviously you just spent the money to get into this brand new home, but truly at the end of the day, we do need to start considering that. If we think about a 20-year useful life on the roof, we need to think about what's going to be 1/20th of that cost and how much should we be setting aside today and in the future years to make sure that coming in the future, that money is going to be there and readily available for us. Good example here. I actually just had a board meeting not too long ago for a high-rise building, and we were presenting our results to the board, and we were going over some elevator repairs, elevator modernization, the mechanicals behind it. And the board president made a really good point during this presentation. He said, man, now that I'm looking at all these numbers and this is all making sense, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put a change box right outside the elevator. And every time a homeowner in our community wants to use this elevator, we're going to have to drop a dime in to go up on those floors. And of course, obviously a joking situation out there, but that mindset, it works. When you think about it that way, that every time we do use our elevator, we should be paying for that today. So then come in the future, when the breakdowns happen and we do need to modernize that elevator, those funds should be readily available and we don't got to worry about scrambling at the very last minute. So our next question is, when we do understand, hey, we got our common assets, we know we're responsible for those, we know we should be funding for those. The next question truly is, what is that number? How much should we be putting into the reserve account every year? And there's a lot of different theories out there. There's a lot of different regulations out there. As I said earlier in the presentation, some states have laws where they do say 10% of your annual assessments should go into that reserve account. In the state of Illinois, their law simply states you need reasonable amounts in the reserve account. In Georgia, there is no regulations whatsoever. Now, if you think about that, the Illinois one makes me chuckle a little bit. Who knows what reasonable is? If you're a board member and you're a volunteer that's stepping up and taking these budgetary actions now, how do you know what reasonable is without knowing what those expenditures are? So these laws, we're going to see these change a lot very quick in the future here. The 10% law also doesn't make that much sense either. Because if you think about it, if you're taking 10% of your annual assessments, and by all means, this is a good baseline, it's better than nothing by all means, but how does 10% of your annual assessments correlate with your capital needs? Every association is going to be extremely unique of what that budget number is going to be. And you don't know what that is until you get a reserve study done and until you have a game plan of here's our expenditures and this is the timeline on all of them. And I do just want to highlight again that associations, there's not a one size fit all. We can't just say, hey, having $1 million in a reserve account is going to be good, because that doesn't always work out. There might be one project out there that could be over $1 million, and it just doesn't make sense out there. So using a baseline or using a flat fee, it's not going to work out. And the reason I bring that up, because truly at the end of the day, and the whole goal behind this reserve study is trying to figure out what is that adequate number? How do we fund this properly? So this picture on your screen right now, this is from one of our studies. This is a recommending reserve study plan. And what this simply shows is those green bars, these are our recommendations of what those annual assessments should be to the reserve account. Those pink bars, maroon bars, are representing what are those total expenditures. So what are those projects that we anticipate that the association is going to take on to correlate with those recommendations. And that blue line there is just representing where is our reserve account balance at. And one thing I want to highlight on here, it's very volatile. Our reserve study balance, it's going to go up some years, it's going to go down. It all correlates on those projects. And it all gets down to that same point of, are we adequately funding to make sure that we do have enough when those projects do come up? And this is kind of a nice, pretty example where those recommended fundings only go up by slight percentages each year, but it makes sense. When we do have those projects coming up, we do have the funds available. And if we follow this plan, we are going to be in a good spot. So how do we get those numbers? How does a reserve study figure out what is that adequate amount? So I do want to highlight, once again, the reserve study, it truly is just a budgeting tool. At the end of the day, this whole idea of the reserve study is to be used for budget season. It's to help you as board members and managers make informed decisions of how to go about that. It's the proof in the pudding. It's the backing behind, if we're going to go in and ask our neighbors for X amount of dollars going to our dues, this is the why behind it, and this is why it makes sense. So to do these reserve studies, they're made up in two distinct parts. Number one being a physical analysis, and number two being the financial analysis. So the very first step for a reserve company is that physical analysis, and we need to figure out, what are you responsible for? So when I say that, the focus is going to be on community maintained assets. We're not looking at private unit owner assets. We're simply looking at what does the community need to upkeep for itself. and we need to think about what are going to be those long-term capital projects. So we got to do a responsibility matrix, and we need to define what are those assets. And once again, that's done by a lot of board feedback. We, of course, are looking at those bylaws, and we're looking to see legally what you are responsible for. And another very key piece of this too, we need to figure out what is the history behind these. What are the ages? When was the association built? When did we have our last replacement on these components? And so this is what I call the pre-work out there. Some very obvious reserve components that are very common on a lot of reserve studies and very common through a lot of associations are roofs, usually the highest ticket dollar out there, one of the most important lines on the reserve study. Some other very common things are clubhouses too. Once again, these shared amenities, what is the community using and what is the community responsible for maintaining? Roads too, roads can be very costly items that we're all using as a community and all sharing. And then there's some components that we often overlook. And, a lot of times when we do reserve studies, there are things that boards just didn't realize that, hey, I knew we had a pond out there, but I had no idea that there was going to be some intensive projects that we just weren't planning for saving up. So we want to make sure when we do these reserve studies that we have every single thing included, and we do need to think about some of those not so obvious ones. Good examples of these: underground plumbing and piping. So if we have water or sewage lines going underground to specific units, a lot of times associations are responsible for those, and we do need to consider, are we upkeeping those? Can we plan for a predictive expense on those? Catch basins, stormwater systems, once again, very common items that often get overlooked that are very important that we do have some sort of capital plan for. So once we have that responsibility matrix built up and we know exactly what your community is responsible for, now we need to conduct a physical inspection. And the whole goal of this physical inspection is we're trying to get the best understanding of how much life is left on these specific components. So a very often term that we use in the reserve study world is just useful life. What are the years left before we can comfortably predict that there's going to be a major repair or replacement out there? We also need to quantify. What I mean by quantify, we need to measure what's the exact amount that the association is for. When we talk about roofs, we need to figure out exactly how many roofing squares are we dealing with. If we're thinking about our roads, what is the square footage of the roads, or square miles in a lot of cases too. So this is all very important information that we need to collect during this physical analysis to once again understand how much do we maintain and what kind of life do we have in there too. So when our engineers do the review, it's all done by visual, non-invasive inspections, and we are looking for several factors to determine, hey, realistically, if these roofs are 10 years old, how much do they have on them? Do they have 15 years left? Do we see any kind of shingles popping up? Are the gutters falling off? Are they in a good spot? These are all things that we're looking for when on site to once again determine what is going to be that realistic, useful life. Now, one thing I would like to highlight though, some confusion out there, we are never going to be 100% perfect on that exact useful life or on those exact costs of the reserve study. So hate to be the breaker of bad news, but we don't have a crystal ball. We can't exactly get all those right timings and right costs. And truly, that's not the purpose of the reserve study. When we think about this reserve study, and let me backtrack, we of course want to be very close and very accurate as possible to it, but we're never going to be 100% right. And the reason is, once again, this is a budgeting tool. We're trying to make sure and prioritize what should be on our radar. If we as the reserve study provider put ourselves and you and the board's shoes, what's the right way to go about this? Which projects do we need to focus on first rather than others? And how do we need to start coming up with these budgetary numbers? What is going to be a realistic amount that we do need to think about for the future to make sure that we do have enough out there? A good example of this, and I keep on using roofs, but we may recommend that your roofs are going to last to 2035. And we're going to put that in the study. And the whole idea behind that is we want to make sure, are we setting aside enough money today, come 2035, that we are going to have that good cushion built up. Your roof, it may last to 2036, may last to 2037. But if we're being proactive and if we're taking those steps right now, we are already ahead of the ball and we're already setting those funds. On the flip side too, maybe there is some additional defects out there. Maybe we don't get to 2035. Maybe the roofs actually do need to replace in 2034. But once again, if we're being proactive, it's not going to be as hard as a hit. And our community should be in a good place to adjust and take on these projects because the last thing we want to avoid is kicking that can down the road. And if we're not taking any kind of proactive measures, then nothing's going to get done. And once again, then we are going to be looking into reaching out to banks or asking for special assessments. So once again, the whole idea is getting things on your radar screen and just focusing, how do we prioritize these? When it comes to our costs too, there is a lot that goes in that. We can't simply just go on site for reserve study and just simply look up material costs, because we know that's not realistically what it's going to take. There's a lot of things that we need to consider when we think about these costs. Is there going to be demolition or disposal involved? Do we need to consider maybe an engineering team, a specialized engineering team needs to come out here and make drawings? We got to consider mobilization costs. A good example, an extreme example, but for a lot of high rises, there's a lot of high rises that need to get airlifted, their mechanicals up to their roof, and that's a very expensive project. And if we have reserve study providers, if we simply just said, hey, yeah, your chillers and your boilers, they got to get replaced, this is the cost to replace it, we are going to be way off in that reserve study. So we want to be as accurate as possible, because once again, we want to be as realistic as possible when it comes to budgeting. Now, when we put together our figures too, we need to talk about prioritization. So our goal will always be structural, safety first over aesthetics. We don't want to disregard aesthetics. And when I say aesthetics, a lot of that is going to be considered, your entry monuments, the beautiful flower beds you have out there, your clubhouse, the inside of your clubhouse. Of course, everybody wants to see that remodeled. We all want that new. We want to have nice amenities, and we don't want to disregard that. But at the same token, if we do live in a townhome community, we want to make sure that the roofs and the siding are in good spots first before we do focus on the clubhouse. And when we generate these plans too, we want to think about that, and we want to make sure we are taking on the important projects too. Another thing we got to consider too is, if we do defer these projects, what's the potential cost? So roofs, once again, very common example out there. If we keep on pushing off our roofs, we're now exposing ourselves for more risk. Now water infiltration could be coming into play. That's just going to increase those costs, and that's going to make those projects that more expensive. So we do want to consider, once again, what is most important and what's going to be most cost effective to do today. Along those lines too, we need to consider, how do we combine projects too? If we have sidings and balconies, can we do those at the same time and save some costs there? If we are considering a loan too, if we're going to go out and obtain a very large loan, what are those critical projects that we do want to focus on all at once, rather than just trying to phase those out and trying to obtain additional loans in the future? These are all things that are being considered in a reserve study. So once we do have that physical condition set, so we have a great idea of what you're responsible for, we know the condition of everything, we have costs all built out, we understand locally what are those contractors going to charge you guys or bid you guys on an average to take care of those. Now we can dive into the financial analysis. So the financial analysis simply takes your current standing, your current financial standing as the association, and it maps out everything along those lines. So we are mapping out. If you recall, a few slides ago, I had that bar graph. This is where all this information is getting put in to make that bar graph. So this is our recommendations. The green bar that you see on your screen there, the total recommended reserve contribution, that's the money line out there. If you're a board member, this is the line that you're always keyed in on, because this is what we are recommending. In this particular example, this association, there was a very big recommendation increase here. In the year 2023, when they started, they were only collecting $120,000 total in reserves. That next year, we actually recommended that they go up to $297,000, because there are major expenditures coming out. I wish I had a laser pointer here. I don't know if I could pull it up. But for example here, if you see in 2026, if you go all the way down, they're anticipated $1.8 million expenditure. So they have a lot of catching up to do. And realistically, this is how we need to start thinking about these. And if you're the board on this association, this is where you need to start having those proactive and sometimes very tough decisions of, hey, we do need to play catch up, because there are some very expensive expenditures coming up. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're following these recommendations, we're going to be at a good spot. We're going to be at an adequate spot that we will have enough funds available to take on these very critical projects. So one of the beautiful things about the reserve study too, once again, is it's backing, it's information, it's giving you guys ammunition to make these decisions. So I do want to walk through some scenarios. So here goes our financial recommendations once again. This is a very cookie cutter example out here. For this association, very minimal increases. Those green bars are just going up a few percent increases every single year. And most of that's just due to inflation. We're just taking inflation factors in. This association has historically done a very good job. They're on top of things. They just need to increase a little bit every year, but they're going to be in a good spot. But let's say, what if this association says, no, that's not going to fly? We like where we're at with our dues, and for the next 10 years, we want to make sure that we keep those dues exactly the same. Well, that same association, if they take that route, come year 2026, they're going to be negative in the reserve study balance. So they're not going to have the funds available for those projects that are coming up for the future years, and they're going to be in a bad spot. But the nice thing about reserve studies too is we can play around with these scenarios. It doesn't always have to just be reserve funds too. So this is the same exact example. And for this scenario, let's say, hey, we understand those increases are not going to fly for the short term, but maybe our homeowners are okay with a very small assessment. So what if we did smaller increases on the reserve side, but did incorporate a special assessment into that? And in this case scenario, it still works out. This association is still going to be in a good spot where the reserve fund balance will be able to take on all these projects. Nothing's going to be missed. Nothing's going to be pushed down the road. And this association is going to be in a very healthy spot. And the only reason why I bring up these scenarios is because, once again, this is a budgeting tool. Our first goal is to provide you with this information. How you enact on it is completely up to you, but without having that information, how do you know what is going to be right come budgeting season? And once again, this is just giving you the ammunition to make those decisions and work with your community to understand what is going to work best for us and how do we want to go about this for the future. So when we think about these reserve studies, they're used in a lot of different ways too. Funding, first and foremost, too. Like I said earlier in the presentation, a lot of banks now are asking to see reserve studies. They want to make sure if you're asking for a loan that you're going to be financially healthy and that you are taking the loan on for the correct projects. A lot of banks out there, if your roofs are coming up to be replaced in the next few years, but you're asking for a loan for a landscape renovation, they're probably not going to want to give you out a loan for a landscaping renovation, considering that your roofs need to get replaced and you're going to need money for that again too. So once again, banks want to make sure that the board does have a good financial outlook out there before they do give out the loans. Regulatory, again, once again, nothing in Georgia is set in place, but I would not be surprised in the near term if we do start seeing some mandates out there that is requiring for community associations to start getting reserve studies done. And then lastly too, something that can often be overlooked, but a reserve study is extremely powerful to have for bids too. Once again, we are taking the average cost for local contractors. We're incorporating all those costs in one so that when you do go out to bids, you have a good understanding of what that scope of work should be. Is there any kind of alternative solutions out there? And it's helping you do some cost comparison to make sure that when your contractors are coming in, are those bids coming in at a pretty good spot? Are they off? Are they too little? But it once again gives you the proof of, are they giving us the correct scope of work, and does this bid seem right? So a question that we often get too is, if you have a reserve study, once again, it's just a snapshot in time. If we do a reserve study today, July in 2025, we are focusing on today's factors and we're looking into some inflationary factors for the future, but it's never going to be perfect. And a lot of things deviate that reserve study. So a lot of people ask us, what is that number? There is no true number out there, but from an industry average, every 2 to 5 years seems to be that sweet spot. In a lot of cases, 5 years is trending to be most state mandates right now. So a lot of those new states that are passing mandates, they are asking for 5 years for reserve studies to be updated. But once again, if you're in a very complex property, if you're in a very large HOA with a ton of amenities, it may be better for you to consider a 2 to 3 year update interval, because you have a lot going on. You have a lot of funds coming in. You have a lot of projects that you're trying to accomplish. And it's important that you are keeping up with that financial plan and do have a fresh perspective on that. So a common question that we do get is, why would we need to update that? What are some factors that would deviate this study? So one big thing is, hail damage, insurance claims. A lot of times we work with associations and they get hit with unexpected things like a hail damage here. So if you're in this association, and this is a very rough example of some pretty gnarly hail coming at the siding, but now your insurance company is taking care of this replacement, and this is not coming out of the reserve fund. So now we need to readjust that reserve study to make sure that we do have a better outlook out there. Federal factors, inflation factors. Man, the past few years have been the most prime example for this. There are things that are just out of our control. No one could have predicted pre-COVID that we'd see these huge inflationary increases or these huge supply chain increases. So the studies that we were doing pre-2020, we didn't incorporate this because we didn't know. Once again, no one knew out there that there would be this severe of impacts out there. But when you consider these are very big impacts to our communities and how we need to financially plan. So when there are very big external factors out there, we do need to consider that update and make sure that we are still on the right track. We understand boards change a lot. A lot of new board members get on board, and they have different prerogatives out there. They want to have different projects accomplished. And so, getting that reserve study updated is once again going to help give them a fresh look and fresh ammunition for that. And associations change. Maybe you're an association that wants to add in a brand new clubhouse. And it's really powerful when you have a reserve study done and a new update completed to see, is this feasible? We can plug those costs in for potential new additions in there to once again give you a better outlook of how does that look in the future? Could we add a new clubhouse? Could we add a new playground? What does that look like in the long run? Then lastly, too, there's alternative components out there. Past 7 years or so, we've been seeing EV chargers pop up. A lot of states, a lot of different townships have mandates out there that we didn't anticipate 10 years ago. But now we do need to consider these in reserve studies. And possibly you may be in a township where they might enact something where X amount of your parking spaces do need an EV charger. And these are things that need to be reserve funded and considered for the future. And there's also just alternative materials out there. James Hardie board was very rarely used, 15 years ago, and now this is seeming like the norm out there, where a lot of associations are going to a James Hardie board over a vinyl. And there's a lot of different situations out there, but once again, a lot of alternatives can really deviate our capital planning. So up next here, I actually have a fun case study that we actually put together early this year. I do want to forewarn you guys, this is a very, very extreme example, but it is kind of neat. So these are two buildings that we actually worked with. We redacted all their information, but these are real life examples that we worked with. And these two buildings are identical. There's an east building and a west building. So back in 2012, we did a reserve study for each of these buildings, and it was a pretty rough reserve study. Both of these buildings were significantly underfunded. They were both built in 1980, but up until 2012, there was not a lot of proactiveness on that reserve funding side. And both those boards understood that there is some very serious projects coming up, and they simply did not have a lot of loans out there, a lot of funds out there to take on these projects. And this is their first time getting a reserve study done. They finally got to that breaking point where they realized we need some help. We need to figure out how we need to start upkeeping our buildings. So this is very unique too, because both these buildings, the community maintained the windows, doors, and balconies, but there was a lot of fighting. Before we did our reserve study, both of these buildings had a lot of meetings going on where homeowners felt like, hey, why is the community taking care of these? We should be taking care of these. So both of these associations, East and West, for the past 2 or 3 years, they were on the border of, man, should we update our bylaws? Should we remove the responsibility of the windows and doors, balconies to the unit owners, or should we keep that? And ultimately, they didn't know what these potential costs were going to be. And the reserve study was the very first starting point for them to understand, hey, okay, what is the outlook for that before we do make these tough decisions? So we did the study in 2012. Condo East, very rough numbers out there, a lot of tough projects coming up. So our recommendation eventually came in that, hey, you guys really need to raise your dues realistically by 60%. We also did the analysis on their windows, doors, and balconies, and we gave them the cost for it, and it was pretty significant costs out there. That board took the information and they said, man, yes, we understand these are tough numbers, but we know for the past few years we should have taken these up. So they eventually had board meetings. They did update their bylaws. They did meet with the board, use that reserve study as proof and say, guys, if you want to take these on yourself, let's have a vote. You can take on these costs yourself. And if you want to redo the ceilings and take care of the balconies yourself, that's going to be completely on you. Eventually, the community, they did vote in favor and say, yes, we do want to take homeowner responsibility for those. And ultimately, they said, yes, we are ready to take these very significant increases. And we understand it's a hard pill to swallow, but we want to make sure that we are taking care of these really big projects. Now, Condo West, on the other hand, almost identical results out there, but the board action was significantly different. So Condo West got the results, and ultimately what happened is they had a meeting with their homeowners, and they were not able to have a productive conversation about the windows, doors, and balconies. And ultimately what happened, the community said, that's all right, we'll still just keep responsibility on those. This is on the association to upkeep. They talked about increasing the dues, but ultimately it came to the point where the homeowners did not want to see those increases, and the board said, okay, I think what we'll do is just keep our regular dues and increase at 5%. So what had happened is we eventually worked with both these communities again in the future. And so Condo East, once again, followed those recommendations. They took the very hard pills to swallow. They got a new roof done. They got the new boiler system done. And in our most recent study, their current recommendations for the reserves came out to $380 per unit per month. And for the next 5 years, they only have a 2.5% increase. And when we think about that too, now they do have brand new roofs, they do have brand new boilers, all those really tough projects were taken in place, and now they're in a very good financial state. Condo West, on the other hand, that did not take those recommendations earlier, when we did their most recent study, they were in a very, very tough spot. They had to take out significant loans to take on some of the roofing projects. Their current recommendations are now $920 a unit per month. Their next 5 years, our recommendations actually came in for another 25% increase, and now they're facing a whole bunch of different problems. Their common area, the interiors, they're still 18 years old. They have no chance of getting those updated because they're still trying to play catch up on these older projects, and they keep on delaying a lot of projects, and they're running into more expensive issues, and they're running into issues where they do need to consider taking out more loans, taking out more special assessments. And the reason why I bring up this case study, once again, this is very abnormal. This doesn't happen to a lot of associations, but the point here is Condo East, they knew ahead of time, they knew there was a tough pill to swallow, and they had productive conversations with their board. And now, 13 years later, they're in a very good spot. Condo West, that decided to continue to kick off this can and not take on these very tough conversations, those issues only got worse. And when we did the most recent study, it was still in a very, very tough spot for them. So I only have 3 more slides to wrap up here, and I do think it's important to consider when you are conducting a reserve study, what are some qualifications that you should look for when it comes to choosing your provider? And I think first and foremost, a reserve study, there's not a lot of set standards out there, but there are certain things you should look for. First and foremost is an RS designation. This is given by Community Association Institute, so please make sure when you do choose a provider that their specialist does have at least that RS specialist. To get that specialist designation, it takes about 200 hours of field work. It takes 5 referrals from community managers. So it has some backing to it, and it should make you more comfortable knowing that you are working with someone who does know what they're talking about, who has had experience with this in the past. Professional engineering license, once again, are not required for reserve studies. But man, it is very nice knowing that you're working with a team that does have PEs on staff that understand these very complicated mechanical systems, structural systems, and it should make you more comfortable knowing that you are getting the right recommendations. Beyond that too, you want to make sure you're working with a team that has a multidisciplinary team background too. So there are a lot of firms out there, specialized engineering firms, that unfortunately, since Surfside, they've seen an opportunity with reserve studies to step up and say, hey, maybe we can do this. We're a structural firm. I think we can make a lot of money off doing these reserve studies. And yes, they were structural experts on a lot of points, but when we think about associations, there is a lot of different components involved. It's not just structural components. We got to think about our roads. We got to think about environmental factors out there. So it's really important when you do work with a team, you have a team that knows a lot about everything, that can give you the proper recommendations for the community as a whole. Local experience, very, very important. When we consider those costs, we need to understand what are going to be those local costs to your community. Contractor costs are going to be wildly different across the country. the scope of work is going to be exceptionally different as well. What we recommend in Florida is a lot different than what we recommend in Atlanta, and that's for good reason too. We want to make sure we're being as realistic as possible. Quality assurance, very important. You want to make sure you're working with a firm that is going through this report, that are spot checking things. And lastly, and most importantly too, please work with a firm that's going to support you. Reserve studies have a lot of information in them, 50 to 150 pages per report. We don't expect you as managers or you as board members to read through every single page. And when you work with a team that's going to take the time to actually do a presentation, walk through those important findings, and really boil down everything for you, is exceptionally different. It's night and day. The boards that we have the opportunity to do that presentation for, it is so much better when they have a good understanding of what went into the whys behind everything and how to read that report. And I think that is one of the most important qualifications out there. So please, when you are considering a reserve study, make sure you work with a team that's going to provide you support, not just today, but years later. You may have questions, you may have new board members in 2 to 3 years. Make sure they can reach out to that firm and still get the answers that they need. So to summarize here, and sorry, I guess I've rambled on a little bit, but the last slide here, important takeaways. Reserve studies are evolving. They're becoming a necessity now when we think about the community association industry. We're going to see a lot of changes out there. Once again, the Fannie Mae Freddie Mac stuff, that's all very new, but that's not going away anytime soon. Banks, insurance companies, they're all asking for these. And this is something that's not just a current fad. This is something that's going to be in place for a very long time. If you're a board member, you have a fiduciary responsibility. Your job is to not cut costs for the community. Your job is to make sure that you are upkeeping those common assets, protecting and increasing the value. When we think about it, that reserve account makes the most sense. If we can get a plan in place today for the future, we're going to be in a significantly better spot out there. And think once again about that case study. If we get this information now, if we have those productive conversations for the future, you're going to be in an exceptionally better spot than if you don't do anything and if you decide to continue to kick that can down the road. And then lastly, too, just make sure when you do conduct these reserve studies, work with firms that specialize this and know what they're talking about. You want to make sure you have accurate information in there and that you are getting the right information, because you're only going to shoot yourself in the foot if you are getting bad information, and it's only going to make things worse. So that is all I got. Once again, I apologize. I think I went over a little bit, but would love to take on as many questions as possible here.
You did great. You were perfect. Before we get into questions, because we did get a couple of questions from the audience, which is awesome, and I'm sure we'll probably get a few more, I wanted to highlight a couple of things that I heard within your presentation that I think are incredibly important. I loved the case study. I mean, I hated the case study for, the actual results, but I think it really showcased a real example of what it could look like. And on that, what we oftentimes see, and, offline, you and I were talking about this, having money conversations is difficult, period. So having a reserve study boards is really going to be so helpful in giving you that evidence and that additional assistance, just like Henry was talking about. But sometimes as managers, we oftentimes see that when there is, deferment of projects, or, hey, we're not able to raise the funds or increase the assessments this year, what ends up happening is you have cascading issues that once were probably not necessarily high priority, now all accumulating into emergency circumstances all at one time. And so it's almost kind of, a circumstance where you want to go ahead and redo the clubhouse, but you've got to redo the roads and the piping first, because you've got plumbing issues that are causing significant, sinkholes in your streets and so forth. And so that's something that I love that you captured and that you talked about that, because unfortunately, I think that happens a lot more often. And we all have our rationale as to why. You are all volunteers that are performing your jobs. A reserve study is a fantastic resource to help you do your job better. I think probably my most favorite part, because I'm just a lover of stormwater management, I love that you put in that particular topic of talking about that oftentimes people, it's not a visual or, plumbing. stormwater management, your lake or your detention pond or your dam. These are oftentimes things that people, they're the more unsexy amenities that we talk about. They're the maintenance responsibilities, not necessarily an amenity that can be creepingly expensive when they are not paid attention to. And so I always love it when I see associations that recognize what their responsibilities are and build that into their reserve study. So I think that's fantastic. And then I'm going to have to say this. All of you board members that have the ability, or homeowners that have the ability to work with professional management, whether it's Heritage or another management company, we are here to help you with this feature and this function right here. So I know it sounded like there was a lot of information and there was a lot of documentation that needed to be compiled and offered and so forth. That's really what management companies and managers can really assist you as volunteers with, helping to provide those invoices. And something that you kind of touched on a little bit too. Obviously, you want to have that initial study done, especially if you're an association that hasn't had a study done in over 10 years. You definitely want to get a brand new one done. But it's so much easier to update your reserve study every couple of years, like Henry was talking about. And that's a really simple process for us as managers to be able to do, because again, we can use those invoices, we can use those proposals that were gathered and generated. And that's also super helpful information for them to keep their costs. Okay, yeah, this is exactly what we are communicating. And I love that you pointed out too, the reserve study cost, while it is an estimate, friends, don't forget your budget is a live, breathing document. You're
Right.
making the
Hmm.
best decisions that you possibly can when you're calculating your budget, but it's a hypothesis, right? It's going to breathe, it's going to have a life of its own. And so when you have a reserve study, that's also going to be incredibly helpful in your bid comparison process when you do get those professional companies that come out that are giving you those proposals for the deck replacement or for the road repaving. All of that can be used as a guide so that, one, you're keeping the vendor honest, which hopefully you're not having to do that too often, but two, you're using in your own discernment of having a nice benchmark of saying, I don't know if this is too expensive. Is this the right kind of cost that we should be, paying for services like this? So I love that you highlighted all of those things right there, because it's really so important. And I couldn't agree with you more. I do think legislation is probably going to be coming down the pike, especially for the state of Georgia, um, just in putting some guardrails in it. And I'd be curious to see what that actually looks like. But from a potential standpoint, we're proud that a lot of our partners currently utilize your services and other professional engineering companies to perform reserve studies and keep those useful life features and prices up to date. And that really helps out with insurance. And that's going to also lead into a couple of the questions that we have queued up for tonight, because I know you talked a lot of high level things, and I really appreciate the things that you did focus on. So let's talk real basic, because believe it or not, we didn't actually get a question about this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. In your experience, and I know it can change for the type of association potentially and their amount of responsibilities, what's the average cost of a reserve
Yeah.
study?
Yeah, great question. So the fees are obviously going to be variable based on your community. What we look for, specifically our team, we're looking to see, how complex, how many amenities is your association responsible for? And that's ultimately what's going to dictate the pricing of how many components do we need to look at and how big is this plan going to be. Now, I would say on average, HOAs, where you typically don't have a lot of shared components, this is where we are dealing with maybe some retention ponds, stormwater management systems, parks, whatever it may be. For a very first time study, our fees range anywhere from 2,500 to 3,500. If you throw in a clubhouse, some nice pools, some of the nicer amenities, it goes up by a few hundred, but typically HOAs, 2,500 to 4 grand. Massive HOAs where you do have, 500 plus multiple clubhouses. Now we're looking probably more to 4 to 6. Um, Once again, it all depends on how many components there actually is. Townhomes, condominiums. Now when we're dealing with shared structures, roofing, siding, driveways, access drives, and all that good stuff. Generally, those fees are anywhere from 3,500 to 5 grand. Once again, not too far off from the HOAs, a little bit more because we do need to consider a lot more structural items out there. If you're in a mid-rise building, where now we're talking about we have shared hallways, we have maybe an elevator, shared mechanicals. That's where our fees are going to be looking more towards 4,500 to 6 grand for a first-time study. And that's, considering a 5-story building that's shared, like an apartment style per se. And then lastly, if you're in a high-rise building where you have multiple stories, major mechanicals out there, facade, generally those fees are anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 for a first-time study.
And then you would say approximately 25 to 50% reduction for every renewal if they stay with your firm. Is that correct?
Correct. So updates are always going to have a discounted price to that. So the process when we do an update is very similar to the very first time, but we already have the bones of the report. We have the structure. We already know what you guys are responsible for. We've already measured everything, and we're still going to make sure, has there been changes? Maybe we do need to add some things in it. Maybe there has been some inclusions. Maybe you were like Condo East in that case scenario where you guys did change your bylaws and you took some things out. So we want to consider that. We're still going to perform a brand new inspection of everything, but it's going to be at a much less fee. Typically, it's about 75% of those original fees.
Okay. So, wow. Okay. That's even better. As I say, that's been my experience, but it's been a little bit
Yeah.
since I've had one done for an association, so I wasn't sure myself. So, thank you for answering those questions. And again, friends, if you are professionally managed, having a reserve study updated is the easiest process because boards, you oftentimes really don't have to do a lot because it's the managers that are pushing through those invoices of the work that was completed. And oftentimes, we also recommend if you've reset a life expectancy back to zero, right? If those roofs have been replaced, you might want to go ahead and update the reserve study because we still don't want to, we don't want to fund whereas those roofs are still being replaced 2 years from now. So just those are all thoughtful things to also keep in consideration that should also trigger an update. So just be mindful of those. So this kind of part of the case study that you had talked about a little bit, how do reserve studies review deck repairs and deck replacements in condominium communities?
Yeah. So once again, I do want to clarify, reserve studies are visual, non-invasive. So our
Right.
engineers are going through a full checklist when it comes to those decks. We're looking at the condition of it. Is it a wood? Is it a concrete deck? There's a full checklist that we are doing, but it is a visual, non-invasive inspection. So we're not, drilling any holes. We're not doing any forensic work, which really brings up a really great point too. And especially when we consider Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all these big structural issues out there. What I like to say about reserve studies is we're like a general physician for associations. We know a lot about everything. We're going to do a checkup on you guys and we're going to look for things that are off. So when we go to your decks, we're looking at it, we're seeing for any kind of deterioration, we're looking for waterproofing issues and all that. If we do see significant issues, so if we see really bad deterioration, let's say your wood deck, that wood's starting to rot, we're going to recommend that this is going to be a very high priority for the association. We're going to recommend that you do see a specialist to get a full-blown understanding of what is going to be that full remedy. Of course, we can supply you with estimated costs of replacements. That's not a big deal. But at the same time, we want to make sure that you guys do have a good perspective on that because that's going to be a pretty major project. And that's where you do want to bring in a specialist. So once again, when you go to your general physician, you're getting a checkup done. If they see something wrong with your heart, your general doctor is not going to be able to solve that right there. They're going to advise you do go somewhere else, get those results. And once again, with the reserve study, when you do have those outside, contractor reports, we can just incorporate that right back into the study to make sure we have exact costs and we have the exact plan of what you guys are going to do.
I love that. That is probably the best analogy I have ever heard. That makes so much sense. And I love the way that you just framed that. So thank you. And I think that that's actually a really great question because I think depending on the type of work too,
Yeah.
sometimes you have people going up in trusses, or you have a visual roof review. So I understand why that person asked that question. So thank you, audience member. If your board is in a position to choose between a loan and a special assessment, how do you as a board go about making the right decision for your community?
Yeah, great question. So, if you guys recall, I went through some of those scenarios too. And the thing that I love about the reserve study And once again, when you're getting the support from the firm and you're working with that engineer, you have that information now. That financial plan, that recommending, we can plug and play. So we can show, hey, if we want to go a loan at X percentage, what's that going to look like in the long run? In the reserve study, that's so easy for us to plug in. If we want to go a special assessment route, we can plug that in too. So the reserve study, it's a living, breathing tool. In our company, we're going to give you the Excel sheet where you have all the options to plug in these different scenarios. We will do it for you. We will consult with you guys to show you what does this look like. And once again, it's so much easier. When you have the study done, now we can start doing those scenarios. Then you as board members, you can have those very productive conversations. Going into the next meeting, you can show, hey, scenario A, guys, this is a bank loan. This is what it looks like. Scenario B, special assessment. Scenario C, if we just want to do reserves, this is what it looks like. And it's a very powerful tool for you guys.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback off of that too, it's how much money and how quickly do you need it is
Exactly.
also
Yeah.
really like that's the short answer. If you're looking at, tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars, this is where we oftentimes see loans being a big source of how that happens. But again, if you have the time period and it's not to use this term loosely, if it's not on fire, if it's not an emergency circumstance that needs immediate resolution, and you have a little bit more time to make better judgment and decisions, this is where having options is so much easier going to your association. And you guys, too, think about it from this perspective, too. It's, as we talked about before, it's difficult having money conversations with your membership, right? You are homeowners in the same community that you're serving as a volunteer. So, wouldn't it be so much easier when you have industry experts that can come or at least give you the information so that you can speak intelligently and give them the solutions in that circumstance? Not everybody is going to like it. You're not doing this for 100%, approval of, yes, I'm in agreement. At the end of the day, we're oftentimes talking about life safety structural requirements for people to access where they live safely. And that's a really, really big deal. Speaking of that, this next question, which I is multifaceted in so many different areas, and I'm glad that this person asked this question here. If you have a large insurance claim, like extreme hail damage, um, don't you just end up paying for it anyway with the increased insurance premiums? So, it's an interesting perspective. I'm not saying that it's not true, but I do want you to kind of talk about the relationship of the reserve study and insurance and how that can play with
Yeah.
associations.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of unique situations out there. Once again, reserve study, we're focusing just on that reserve account. Operational things we don't dive into. So it's not like we're plugging your policy into that reserve study. And we can't predict when these things happen. Of course, no one can predict some hail damage out there, but we do understand that if you do have a very big policy increase, I know some associations sometimes have to take those funds away. And I think, our best recommendation is we have this report built out to the best of our ability and to the data we have available out there too. When changes like that happen, this is where we need to talk about getting it updated. A lot of different ways to get updated. There is something called a level 3 non-site visit update, and we often use this a lot when insurance claims come in. This is where we don't do an inspection again for the association. It's simply we get on a virtual call, we talk about what happened, you provide us the data for what happened, and then we can tweak the plan based off of that. So, once again, maybe we do have to move that siding project out because it's all brand new. Potentially, maybe the association did have to take some funds away to cover that policy increase too, and that's just something else we'll have to adjust in that study. Do want to be transparent. That level 3 option is awesome. The reserve study standards through Community Associations Institute, they did update those standards. We can only do that up to 3 years since the last inspection. So anytime it's been 3 years since our last inspection, we are required to do a brand new inspection just to make sure that your plan is as accurate as possible. So there is one little tweak there, but if you get a study done, let's say you had one done last year, something does happen, we don't need to come back out to look at the property all over again. That's where we do want to use that tool just to do a quick financial update.
That's I Fantastic. Thank you so much. And actually, you just taught me something new about CAI. I didn't know that they put that provision in there, and that makes total sense, by the way. I mean, it really does for both the association and the service provider, just from a liability standpoint. Okay. So we do have a couple of follow-up questions, but I'm going to get through these first. So I thank you, audience members, for being so interactive. Does everything you discussed this evening equally apply to POAs?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Any
Yeah.
kind of, I mean, think of any kind of association where you have capital assets, a reserve study applies for it that same exact way. So POAs,
Right.
absolutely. We work with a lot of golf clubs, yacht clubs. Same thing.
Yep.
It's not a residential association, but there's still a group that has shared buildings, shared assets. They have members that pay in these dues, and they need to get a plan in place. Yeah. So golf clubs are a very common one. Even right now, too, what we're seeing is a lot of commercial entities are starting to reach out to us,
That's
hotels. So people that are not even association that just need that third party to
so
help them
great.
make better decisions too, because when you're just the sole owner, and of course a lot of commercial, institutes have their own kind of asset management program, but sometimes they need that third party help and they need that reassurance of, do we have the right plan in place and are we sure that we are on the right path? So this reserve study applies to everybody. Anywhere where you have shared assets, the reserve study can help.
Yeah, and think about it from this perspective. Even if you're that association, like we were talking about just a moment ago, that has the unsexy amenities, right? You have the front entrance and the monument sign, you have a detention pond and maybe some perimeter fencing. What's the type of fencing? Is it wrought iron? Is it stack stone? How many entrances do you have?
Yeah.
What is part of that? That absolutely is still responsibility of the association, and it doesn't have to be tennis courts. It doesn't have to be a clubhouse. It doesn't have to be any of those things. A reserve study is really just a useful tool, regardless of what you have. Now, if you're an association that has a monument sign, sometimes this is where we have the conversations and they're like, we don't own any, we're not really
Right.
responsible for a lot of things. And I think you had kind of mentioned this in your presentation. This is where, you want to at least be able to have appropriate funding for replacement of the things that you do have, insurance claims that may pop up, and that you are making some considerable contribution on an annual basis from the ownership. So those just a couple of points
Yeah.
to pull out there. Because we as managers, we get that question a lot. We only have 24 homes and we don't have any amenities. I'm like, but you have responsibilities, and those sometimes, are not as fun as the pool, or some other things like, an elevator. So, all right, are reserve accounts limited to existing assets? So, if the HOA decides to add a back gate, entrance, exit to the neighborhood, could a reserve account be legally used? Ooh, interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would. That one I would refer to your legal expert
Yeah, I was gonna
behind
say.
that. Um, yeah, refer to your legal expert on that when it comes to dedicating those funds from the reserve account. A lot of different scenarios. We've seen a lot of different things out there. At the end of the day, please use your legal expert when you're trying to make those decisions.
But if
When you
you
do,
are adding something,
yeah,
then we can totally add it.
yes,
Again, in the example that you used, or I think you had talked about, they updated their bylaws, appropriately, and were able
yes.
to communicate those things, or have the maintenance responsibilities differed, from the original declaration. So that's maybe
And I
that's partially what the person was asking.
And let me clarify too, there's been a lot of reserve studies we've done where we have done theoretical situations where something has not been approved yet. Like the bylaws have not been
Gotcha.
approved. They just wanted to get theoretical costs on things. So we have provided services in that study where it just shows, hey, this is option B. Theoretically, if we do add a pavilion or whatever it may be, this is what those potential costs are. But it's not set in place because we don't want to establish a report for something that's not technically in the bylaws yet. It's just a theoretical situation.
All right, so we have three more questions and then we will wrap up for the evening. So thank you for everybody that is staying to engage with Henry. Thank you for your time and kind of extending yourself, Henry. We really appreciate the
Yeah,
content that
not a
you're
problem.
offering right now. All right, so this is going back to the visual inspection that you had mentioned. If you do a visual and a non invasive inspection, how do you assess underground infrastructure needs like pipes and drains and underground stormwater management? Great
And
question.
awesome question. Yes, very common question out there. And the answer is underground pipes, we can't see. We're not digging up those pipes. So when it comes to those situations, we're trying to use the best historical data that we know. So if your association's very old, let's just, not very old, but let's just say 1960s out there, we have predictive data to assume, hey, could we potentially expect maybe some storm piping replacements in the near future. So a lot of that is just built on historical data. Same as stormwater systems too. We are not going inside those stormwater systems, and there are plenty of great specialists in your area that do those services. But we're just trying to predict, based on the historical information of your community, can we predict something that could potentially pop up out there? And those are a lot of case scenarios where, yes, there's going to be a lot of give out there. We do, once again, we'd recommend, if we do think that this is going to be in your plan out there, probably do want to get a specialist to get the firm answer on it, but it's a good idea to start having those funding conversations in mind.
And then you also said that you could incorporate those reports that you get, that an association gets from an expert and build it into the model for the reserve report as
100%.
well.
The
Which is
more
that's just a great partnership right there.
the more data we have, the more accurate we can be on these reserve studies. So, that step one slide, that pre-work slide, we don't
Right.
want to burden you guys with trying to pull out every single document possible of the association. But it is nice when we do know, like, has there been any issues out there? Have you had any kind of piping issues before? That's really important for us to understand so we can better predict some potential future problems out there. And when we do have documentation, we do have data available, it makes these plans that more realistic.
Love it. Fantastic. Okay. So, this is a fun one. This is like, how do you differ? Oh, I love this question. How does your inspection slash engineers differ from home inspectors? Say it's a non-high rise single family home neighborhood. So, okay, if you're asking specifically from an individual asset from single family, that's going to be different because reserve studies are being done on the common area assets. But I'll go ahead and I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hit it right on the head too. And I would say this, the inspection process, that visual thing is very similar. Like if you're buying a home, you have a home inspector come in, of course, they're just looking at your home assets. But that inspection process of the visual, taking photos, looking, kind of going through a checklist, it is very similar out there. Reserve study specialists, once again, we're just looking at those common assets. And the lucky thing about our company and what we do, we've done almost 40,000 of these studies throughout the nation. We have a lot of data. We've seen a lot of everything. And when we do our inspections, we know what to look for. We've been through so many unique associations. We've been honored to work with a ton of associations down in Atlanta. So we understand what are the things that we need to be looking for on this inspection. What have we seen in the past? And we database all of this. And once again, we're very fortunate. We're at the spot where we are right now, where we do have the most engineers out of anybody in the world that specializes just in reserve studies. And so we have a very sophisticated checklist to understand what can we predict for your community, and what have we seen in the past. And trust me, we still see new things all the time,
I
and we
bet.
just we learn and we just get better from that.
I will say this, all of my experiences with my communities and boards that have used your services have had such great experiences. And from a manager standpoint, you make my life, our lives, so much easier. He didn't really focus on this too much, but what he was talking about is they do have an option for associations where they give you an Excel spreadsheet where you can manipulate the formulas if you wanted to. It is amazing, the different capabilities that are out there for you to be able to forecast appropriately. So thank you for asking that follow-up question and for understanding the difference between the two. So if you're in a single family neighborhood, we totally want you to also equally have a home inspection. You are
Absolutely.
responsible for the exterior and the interior of your home. That's your physical asset. That's where you live. We want you to have the best experience and have the best equity out of that. So, yes, that would be something that you personally would do versus the association would use the assessments gathered and utilize that towards any common area reserve study information that's being gathered on the benefit and behalf of the entire homes within the community. So just kind of delineating that difference as well. So, all right, the last one, and this might be a question for me, I don't know, but are reserve funds invested? I like this
uh,
question.
yeah. So once again, we're not financial advisors. We're not going to tell you where to put your money, but absolutely, your reserve account, there are plenty of options that you can grow your money with that reserve account. And we're going to recommend that you do seek out, local bankers that are going to give you the best options possible to make the most of your money out there. And we do incorporate that into a study. So when we look at your reserve account, we are incorporating, are you making any kind of interest on this
Oh,
account?
that's
Because that's
awesome. Yes.
important. We want to make
Yeah.
sure that we are as accurate as possible out there. But I do want to be transparent. We're not going to guide you of where to put that. We don't do any financial advising. We're simply just trying to give you the most accurate report and outlook for those funds.
Right. Just as an FYI, too, property managers are not financial advisors either, although we do have financial partnerships that we can, put you in contact with for your monies. But, oftentimes, especially for high rises or for large scale master plan associations that have, several homes and an amenity features, oftentimes you have to have your assets in multiple accounts because of the FDIC limit of $250,000. So just these are the things that you want to keep in mind. Obviously, you want to make the best options available for your association. And when you are investing your money in a healthily safe manner, that's also another great way that you can help offset annual increases
Hmm.
every single year. So again, it's not going to prevent you from having to increase your assessments, but if you do have the ability to invest your reserve funds, that is such a great way. And we have associations that use CDs,
Hmm.
money market accounts. So just putting some of those examples out there. And as we kind of wrap up for tonight, Henry, you've been wonderful. Thank you to the audience who's asked so many great questions. If some of you in the audience still have any, revolving questions, just like Henry said, we're going to send a feedback email out tomorrow. We would love for you to respond with any additional questions that we did not get a chance to address tonight, or as you're kind of processing some of the information, you have something pop up, we would love to be able to go ahead and get you connected with Henry so we can get that answered for you. But also, you've also asked some really great questions on multiple topics like insurance, how to best financially plan for some of these things. And Heritage University has great resources available for you. We have a huge library, and I feel like if we're not at 49, this might actually be our 50th class that we've done. So we're really proud of the very vast library that we have made available for all of you. It is 50. I was right. And so I'm sure if there's a topic that you would like to get more knowledge or more details on, I'm sure we probably have that in our library on our YouTube page, or you can also visit our homepage, heritageproperty.com, and go to our calendar of classes under homeowner resources, or community resources, I should say. And you'll be able to see the list of what we've got coming up for the remainder of this year. And then in a few days, this class will be available for you to watch on replay. And then in a couple of days after that, it'll be available on our YouTube channel. So if you think that anybody else would benefit from learning about this information or taking the time to hear it, we want you to feel free to share this information. Again, coming to Heritage University, you don't have to be a board member. You can be a homeowner. You don't have to be a Heritage partner, although we would love for you to be partnered with a professional management company if you have that capability. This is really just a great resource for all of you to get some educational content and some support to help you be the best versions of a neighbor, a board member, a volunteer, or a homeowner as you can be. So thank you to everybody that joined us tonight. Henry, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing all of you in the audience again real soon. Have a great evening.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Everybody have a great night.